Okay, so what's the real difference between a list and a card, and why should I choose one over the other? Well, for the majority of apps, cards and lists are going to make up most of the content that is consumed by users. Cards are often most useful for grouping multiple pieces of information together, like an avatar, username, timestamp, video, caption. Think of your standard Facebook post and multiple versions of those all in a timeline. It's better to have those borders in place in a card-like environment, so it's easier to see what information is contained inside of what boundary. Lists are most often used as a utility where scannability is a really big factor in the overall experience. Think about when you're scanning news headlines and you're looking for something that stands out, or you're scanning price, or you're comparing things and you're looking at features. This one has it, this one doesn't, this one does. So they're used for different scenarios, and one's not necessarily better than the other. So let's take a look at a few examples. All right, so in this simple layout, we have lists here and we have cards here, just in a very stylized kind of low fidelity type of layout. And I want to point out a couple of differences here, that these lists, when you have like an image or an icon and some text information, it doesn't always signify interactivity. It's not always so noticeable that you can actually tap or click on this, which is why oftentimes on a list, you'll have one of those little forward facing little arrows on that side that looks something like this. Just put a little stroke on that for now and change the color, make it a little bit bigger. A lot of times you'll find a little arrow on lists like this to make it a little bit more interactive. It's not always required, but you will find that to enhance the interactivity. One thing about lists though is it does emphasize the hierarchy. Most of the time in a list, most important information is going to be at the top, and also definitely more scannable. So if you have a list of things like this and you want to just check out the title, you can just scan right along this line and you can gather that information really quickly, whether it's a price or a title, square footage, anything where something kind of needs to be compared quickly and you want to just scan the information and find something a lot more quickly. Lists can be more helpful. And they also oftentimes take up less space. You can condense a list into much tighter of a space. This list right here might be kind of a large list. You could imagine that if I made these images a lot smaller by just kind of making them the same size as this, we could actually get a lot more space if I were to make these smaller, and then I could bump this stuff up. So there's a lot more room to work with when you're using some type of list. More often than not, you're going to group smaller amounts of content inside of lists. It's not going to work if you have lots and lots and lots of data with multiple objects and you have tons of data, and then, kind of the same thing over and over and over. The separation of content becomes a little bit harder to know, which pieces of content belong where. Sometimes this might work better in kind of a card format. So in cards tend to signify interactivity. I have this giant tile that says, hey, that you can probably click here. Cards tend to also de-emphasize hierarchy. So you have these big objects that you can scroll through, look through, and kind of explore. When you don't really want to specifically find anything in particular, you just want to explore, see the options. Sometimes cards can kind of de-emphasize that hierarchy and promote exploration. Cards are also less scannable, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you were trying to price shop and price compare, maybe your best bet is to go to the list. But if you just want to promote products and show what's available in kind of this exploratory fashion, then you don't need it to be scannable. So it's okay to have these less scannable cards. It's also worth pointing out that cards end up taking up more space. Most of the time inside of a card, you need a little bit of padding around, say your content is like right in here. You need that padding from the edge so it doesn't look too crowded and too contained. And then you also need negative space between the cards, and then you have to have padding again. Whereas with a list, especially if you're not using borders, you can just use negative space right in between the objects in the list, and you can have a more condensed layout. All right, so now let's take a look at how the same content can kind of progress from a list into a card layout, and why you would possibly want to consider using one or the other. So over here on the far left, I have your straight up list, and and it's got no border and it's only divided by negative space. So if we zoom into this one, you can see some type of image, whether it's a thumbnail or an icon. I intentionally want these to be kept at low fidelity just so we can kind of illustrate the differences. We've got list here, straight up list, only negative space. All right, right here, we're still kind of in that list world, but now we've brought in a partial divider. You can see it's just starting right here at the edge of the text and it extends all the way to the right edge. So some type of partial divider. This is more similar to like the iOS style in their settings and some of the other kind of standard native iOS apps. All right, so you can see in this third example here, we've got a border that's kind of coming all the way across here. So on this example, I've got like 16 pixels of margin on each side. And this is going to be, you know, kind of like your standard divider. It's still a list. It's still kind of scannable content. We're just kind of further accentuating that border. But as opposed to just a straight up list like this with negative space only, now instead of just space between objects, we need space between the object and the divider, and then the divider and the other object. So now we're doubling that negative space when we're using a border. And you can get away with a little bit less in this example. Right in here, I've got like 33. Right in here, I'm going a little bit larger to kind of make room for this additional divider. And this might seem trivial to use this tiny amount of space, you know, worrying about 16 and 32 pixels. But when you're working with lots and lots of information, it's going to make a big difference when it's all said and done. You can see here on this fourth example, I'm using a really large divider here. And if you kind of zoom out, it's almost unrecognizable whether or not these are black modules sitting on top of this color background, or if the entire background is black and I'm using these dividers. It's a little bit kind of ambiguous. So number 4 is kind of the most hybrid of them all when it comes to borders and dividers, because you could technically infer that this is the full background or that it's just a really thick divider. And then finally, on the fifth example here, technically this is still a list, but we have a full true card view. And most of the time when you're using a card view, you'll have a little bit more information, but I wanted to keep it the same for this purpose, just so we could see kind of all the different variations. In this example now, I'm really concerned about the interior space. I've got 20 pixels all the way around the image and on the top, the left, and the bottom. And then I've got 12 pixels around the card and the border of the frame, and also 12 pixels in between. And then again, I've got 20 pixels all the way around, but you can tell that from the very edge, I'm about 32 pixels from the edge, whereas like over here, I'm like 16. So I've had to double the space, and I'm losing a lot of space here, and especially important when you're on mobile screens, but I'm losing a lot of space when I get into this card view. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Lists aren't necessarily better than cards, and cards aren't necessarily better than lists. It just depends on what you're designing for and what is more valuable on the screen real estate. If you just have a little bit of content, you can kind of get away with doing whatever you want to do. But if you have lots and lots of content, you'll probably want to make the most use of that space, and you'll try to reduce the amount of gratuitous margin and padding as much as you can. So if we look down here at these examples right here, I've pulled some examples that kind of pull from this same progression, this 1 through 5 progression of list to card. So you can see here on the Spotify app, these are the playlists, and these are all tappable. You know, you can tap on each one of these, but look, there's only negative space separating them. There's no additional borders, there's no lines, there's no card. It's just straight up negative space only. And on the Apple iOS native mail app, you have your kind of partial line here. So as you can see, I've got a lot of negative space here, a lot more negative space over here. And typically that's reserved for the little blue dot that would indicate an unread message, or if you've flagged one of your emails or you've starred it, any kind of notification, there's room for that over there. And they've intentionally not placed the divider all the way across, just so it breathes a little bit better. But then over here, closer to the interactive arrow, they do have the border going all the way across. And I think that just helps separate, you know, that interactivity when you're driving from this screen down into the detail screen. And then on this example, we have that full width border. On mine here, I left a little bit of room, but you can see here, this goes all the way across. So this is a very custom view of a receipt tape from CalcBot. And as you enter your information, this receipt will continue to kind of pull in all the calculations that you've added. But they're taking, you know, a very segmented list stance on here. And so they're just bringing their own line all the way across, and it's more of a custom view. Now, there's nothing to say that they couldn't have stopped the line short here, that they couldn't have stopped here, and then they couldn't have stopped the line there. It's definitely a stylistic perfect decision, and there's not really a wrong or right answer for here, unless they try, if you try to add that margin there in between here for this type of list, then maybe it's not quite as segmented and it doesn't look as good. If you decide to venture away from a standard native practice like iOS does with their list dividers, then you just kind of make your own case for doing it a little bit differently. And then this fourth hybrid example, I've pulled the a Facebook group screenshot here, and you can see like they're technically they're doing a card here. This is a big card, and you could make the case that this is either a big divider or it's the background. And then right here, this is either a big divider or the background. And this is, again, either a big gray divider or the background. To me, it feels like they're probably using this as background, and that these are big full width cards that just expand the entire screen, because there's a lot of content here. There's this topic card, there's the post card, the group card with all these avatars. There's lots and lots of things that are on here, and it's going to make more sense for them to have these very clear dividers and then treat these as cards instead of this last example. You can see on the Apple iOS App Store, they've got a very, very big margin here on both sides, lots of padding, and then these huge cards that, kind of lend themselves to exploration. Think about the Facebook example. If they were not going full width and they brought it in like 16, 20, 24 pixels and used true cards with padding, then that would extend the vertical height of all of their content. And it's already a lot of stuff to scroll through. So they're trying to maximize that screen real estate. And there's not really a right or wrong answer, but I think in the Facebook example, because they have so much content, it's going to make sense that they use that card view, but it's fully extended into kind of that full width version. So because they have a lot of content, they don't really want to use just straight up negative space or lists, but because they're using cards, they're kind of using that hybrid approach. So they're bringing that full width version in, versus the App Store here, they aren't that concerned with tons and tons of data, because they're just showcasing a few apps, a few kind of a gallery of apps every day, and they don't need it to be this huge amount of information. They just want this nice way to display the new apps. Another really interesting thing to keep in mind here for lists versus card when you're trying to figure out how to lay out your content is going to be the law of proximity versus the law of common region. And most of the time, I don't go too nerdy on the UX laws and the Gestalt principles of human psychology when it comes to layout. But in this case, these two are very key in understanding what makes a list versus a card better than the other. So let's take a look. In this example, we've got the law of proximity working here. Right now, if we just kind of look at the negative space here, 2 and 3 are closer to each other, and then 4 and 5 are closer to each other, and it looks like 1 and 6 are just kind of hanging out on their own. So if I were to make an assumption about what it belongs in a group and what is related, I would say, okay, 1 is kind of in its own world, 2 and 3 are kind of in their own world, 4 and 5 are a group, and then 6 is kind of an outlier over here, just like number 1. And that works perfectly. This is great for a list because the negative space, it tells you the proximity of things, it tells you what's related to what, and it gives you a way to kind of understand that content and a way to group it together. And this is especially useful if you're going to use negative space. You have to keep in mind that law of proximity. The things that are closer to each other without borders or cards or dividers, those things are going to look more closely related. Whereas now, if you look at this bottom one, the law of common region comes into place. And that's just going to say that anything that shares a border or a common region, it's going to feel a little bit more closely related. And so you can look up here. This is the exact same layout. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are all in the same exact place. But now, because I put this border around, now we can see, oh, okay, well, in this example, 1 and 2 are related, and 3 and 4 are in a group, and 5 and 6 are in a group. So it's a lot clearer what is related to what, even though 2 and 3 are very close together and 4 and 5 are very close together. Now that we have this card layout and this border surrounding it, it gives everything a common region. 5 and 6 share a common region, 3 and 4 share a common region, and 1 and 2 share that common region. So that's what makes cards a really popular technique, because it's a lot easier to group information inside of a bordered area. And it gives a very clear line of delineation around what content is related and what's not. Even if the 3 and the 4 aren't as closely related as the 2 and the 3 in proximity, the law of common region is always going to trump the law of proximity. Take that with a grain of salt. It doesn't mean that you should always use a card. Sometimes negative space looks better, but if you have a lot of information, it's a lot easier to put a border around it. You just have to be mindful of the color, that you don't make the border too thick, too strong. You don't want the border to overpower the content. So for list and card homework, I want you to create some type of activity feed for your fictitious app, or choose something else if you're getting tired of working on that. But I want you to come up with a list of information, and I'll put some of that information down below, like an avatar or an icon, a title, maybe a sentence or two, a timestamp, just some general information that's kind of like right on the line of, is this a lot of content or is this a little bit of content? Some type of content that could be separated with negative space only, or an iOS style border, or a full width border, or kind of that hybrid approach, or a simple kind of like card layout. So I want you to take that exact same information that you come up with, all the ingredients for those little list items, and then try those 5 different types of layouts. It might surprise you in terms of which one feels better than the other, and it's really going to come down to what is the overall aesthetic that you're going for with your app in general, and also how much information you're going to put in play. So there's a lot of things to factor in, and I've got some design considerations for you to kind of scan through and check as you're doing that homework. So best of luck to you on this, and I can't wait to see what you come up with.